In the previous chapters, we have built up from one person being recruited, through them being trained, through them having a manager, through them being motivated, and through them working in the accounts department. Now we're going to have to start thinking about what happens to an entire organisation. So for the first real time in Chapter 10, we start looking at what's going on outside the organisation and how this affects what's going on inside the organisation. So we started with a very narrow focus, one person being recruited, built it up and up and up. The last thing we looked at was the accounts department, and now we're going to talk about the outside world. So the macroeconomic environment is all to do with the things in the outside world that actually affect an organisation. Obviously, this is a very, very big deal in real life. Things in the outside world affect companies and the way they're structured all the time. If the economy is doing badly, we may need to have redundancies. If the economy is doing well, then we may have to be having extra divisions. So this is a very important thing in real life. Now, the good thing about Chapter 10 is, although it's about what goes on in the outside world, it's not really very detailed. It's not an economics paper, so it's very, very basic stuff. It's the sort of stuff that, to be honest, if you read a paper once a week that includes some business news, you probably come across most of these things anyway. So it's nothing to be frightened of. So the macroeconomic environment is what we're going to talk about. First of all, then, what do we mean by economics? Production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. That's just the standard definition in case you get asked it. It's all about producing things, getting them to customers, and it's about the consumers actually using them and then needing more, which need to be produced, and so on. It goes around in a circle. Macroeconomics is talking about the economy as a whole. Microeconomics talks about individual companies. We're not really bothered about that. Macroeconomics is talking about the big picture. Now, this is the sort of thing that they will have in a newspaper, on a news programme, on the television, where they're talking about how well an individual country is doing. The kind of things that we're looking for: demand for goods. Is it going up or down? Output of goods. How much do we produce? Now, obviously, if we demand more than we produce, we are going to have to get those extra products from somewhere. That's what they tend to be talking about when they talk about us importing products. It's because we can't make enough at home. Some of you may have talked, or you may have come across something called the trade balance. That's all to do, in effect, with how much we're importing and how much we're exporting. So, how much do we want? How much do we make? If there is a difference, that needs to be made up somehow. Factors of production. Land. Labour in particular. Capital. Finance. So do we have enough finance, or do we have to borrow the money from overseas banks in order to invest in the UK? Do we have the right kind of workers in the UK, or do we need to train them to do something different? Over the last few years, one of the reasons why China and India have become particularly strong is that they have a supply of cheap labour. So in industries where that is important, a lot of manufacturing has, for example, gone over to China because they've got one of the factors of production. National income and expenditure. National income, where do we get money from? National expenditure, what do we spend money on? Now, oversimplifying things, but a good way, at least, to think initially about income and expenditure. Income is what we raise from taxes, and expenditure is what we spend it on. It is more than that, because it's not just the government. It could be I perhaps earn some money from abroad. That's part of the national income. I perhaps spend some money abroad. I go on holiday and I spend some money. That's part of the national expenditure. But a lot of that is going to be made up by the government. Finally, a big thing is going to be government policy. So are they trying to expand? What exactly are they trying to do? Macroeconomic policy. Most countries are trying to achieve similar things. They want the economy to grow. The economy growing basically means that people become wealthier. So when we're talking about the economy that's growing, we mean people will have more money. They'll have better standards of living. That's what we tend to be talking about. Low inflation and low unemployment. So an ideal situation will be people are working and inflation's not going up. Those two may be incompatible with things. The trouble with those two is, as more people have jobs, they want to buy more things with the money they earn. That tends to put inflation up. Inflation is all to do with more people want things than can provide it. If you've got 10 customers and only one supplier, there will be inflation, because the supplier will obviously sell to whoever is going to offer them the most money. So if you have got low unemployment, lots of people working, it often means high inflation. Similarly, if you've got very few people working, if you've got high unemployment, there is no demand, you have low inflation. Often, they go opposite each other. At least that's the theory. In real life, it's a lot more complicated than that. Finally, we've got their macroeconomic policy, the balance of payments. As I said earlier, the balance of payments is all to do with money going out of the country, money coming into the country. Most countries don't want to owe too much money. So a balance of payments surplus, more money comes in than leaves, is better than a balance of payments deficit. More money is leaving than is coming in. Again, the trouble is, if you are spending lots of money abroad and you're not importing a lot of stuff, it's actually quite difficult for the economy. It's got implications for how much the currency is worth and stuff like that. Fiscal and monetary policy. In order to try and get all these things to work, the government basically has two weapons that it can use. Monetary policy, and in a minute we'll talk about fiscal policy. Monetary policy is all to do with things like interest rates. Now, in the UK, when the Labour government came to power in 1997, they gave the Bank of England freedom to move interest rates as they wanted to. So in the UK, that one is not an option. In the Eurozone, France, Germany, etc., again, the European Central Bank is independent and will do what it wants to. In America, the Federal Reserve is probably more guided by what the American government wants. So in some countries, the government might be able to say, we will put interest rates up, we will put them down. Again, very, very, very broadly, and again, please appreciate this is a complicated subject and we're not worried about the complexities of it. Very, very broadly, you put interest rates down if you want to boost the economy. Interest rates going down means people don't have to spend as much on their mortgages. Therefore, they have more money in their pockets, which they will go out and spend on other things. Companies that have borrowed money don't have to spend as much paying the debt back, therefore they will spend the money on other things. The idea is that if interest rates go down, people buy more. So it's one of the ways that you can try and boost an economy. Similarly, if you want people to stop spending as much money, again, perhaps because there is inflation, and you don't want people to be buying as much stuff, then you put interest rates up. That's the idea. Foreign exchange policy. Again, if we have a lot of buying and selling with overseas countries, if, for example, the pound is very strong, it means that imports are very cheap. So it means it's very cheap for a British person to buy something from abroad. You start buying things from abroad, you start importing. On the other hand, it makes it very expensive for somebody else to buy a British product. So imports go up, exports go down. Now, the trouble with that is it means money is leaving the country, and the government may not want that balance of payments deficit. So again, those are two broad things that the government can do. Fiscal policy is all to do with spending, borrowing and taxes. Government spending. If we want to boost the economy, we will increase spending. We will spend money on hospitals. We will spend money on infrastructure. road building, etc., etc. One of the things that the American government did in the 1930s, following the Great American Depression, was they just started building things almost for the sake of it. If you build something, it means you need labour. If you build something, it means you need materials. You start giving people money for doing something. Once they've got that money, they then spend it on something else. And that gives other people jobs. It's in a way to have kick-starting the economy. So government spending could go up, again, if you want to get more people working. Now, the only trouble with government spending going up is it has to come from somewhere. And there's only two places. Governments borrow the money, or they tax people for the money. Now, what you might have then is you may have a situation where governments want to spend more money, but they don't want to put taxes up for whatever reason, in which case they'll have to borrow more. Now, borrowing money is fine for today, but at some point they have to pay that money back. So there is always a big balancing act that has to go on that governments have got to try and do. How much should they spend? How much should they tax people? And how much should they borrow? Now, when economies in the world are doing badly, as they are in 2008, then governments are tempted to spend more. They don't want to put taxes up because that takes money back out of people's pockets and they can't spend it on things, so they'll have to increase borrowing, which is going to cause problems potentially at some later date. Now, again, you don't have to understand all this in any great detail. It's not an economics exam, but hopefully you can see the link. If we want to spend more, we either tax more or we borrow more. Similarly, if we decide we want to put taxes down, then the most likely thing we're going to do is spend less. So it's always a balancing act that's going on.